Hit subscribe, new episodes weekly to sharpen your sound.
Okay, so have you ever been cruising through your favorite playlist, right? Volume knob locked in place, everything's fine, and then bam. One song hits different, just feels bigger, more powerful, louder than the last one, even though you haven't touched a thing.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
How is that even possible? It's like music has this secret, invisible language of loudness, kind of pushing and pulling you emotionally without you even realizing it half the time. Well, that mystery, that whole phenomenon, is exactly what we're going to unpack today.
That's right. And it isn't just some random occurrence or, a trick of the ear. This profound impact, this entire mystery, it all comes down to understanding something truly fundamental in audio. Amplitude. And its universal measurement in decibels, or dB. It's this invisible yet incredibly powerful element that, every producer, every engineer, every artist wrestles with. It shapes the sound we hear in the most profound ways, often completely subliminally.
And it's so much more than just, turning a knob up or down. Audio engineering, really, it's this incredible mix, isn't it? It's acoustics, physics, tech, art, psychology, electronics.
Music itself, of course.
And music, exactly. Mastering amplitude and decibels isn't just about learning numbers. It feels like unlocking the secret language of sound itself. How it whispers, how it roars, how it can subtly tug at your emotions or, smack you in the face. It's the craft of making sound feel alive.
Indeed. And for this deep dive, we've pulled together, a fascinating stack of sources. We've got classic audio engineering handbooks laying out those timeless principles. We have modern mastering blueprints and some really in-depth discussions about the very latest digital standards.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and how they've basically revolutionized the industry. Our mission today is essentially to follow a single sound on its complete journey. From the physical world, where it starts as just a ripple in the air, right, through its meticulous digital capture and processing, all the way to its final polished form, the music you actually love. We'll show you how its levels are controlled, how they're shaped, and ultimately how those intentional decisions help tell a compelling story within the music itself.
And hopefully what you'll gain from this isn't just like dry technical knowledge, although there'll be plenty of that.
Sure.
You'll hopefully develop a much deeper, almost visceral appreciation for the incredible craft and artistry that goes into the music you adore. You'll start to hear the intentionality behind every sonic decision, understanding how those seemingly small choices about sound levels convey so much meaning and emotion.
Building tension, releasing energy.
Exactly. Drawing you in or hitting you with sheer force. It's a whole new dimension of listening, really. Okay, let's dive in. We have to start right at the absolute beginning, the very first breath of sound. What is amplitude?
Right. At its most basic level, amplitude is quite literally the height or magnitude of a sound wave. Imagine it as representing how much the air pressure or, in an electrical signal, the voltage fluctuates from its perfectly still resting level, that 0 point. If you could see a graph of a sound wave, amplitude would be the measurement from that central resting line up to the wave's highest point, its peak.
Right.
The higher that peak, the greater the amplitude. Simple as that, really.
So higher amplitude means a louder sound. That's a direct, pretty intuitive correlation, right?
It is.
When you turn up the volume on your device, you're not just making it louder abstractly. You are literally increasing the wave's amplitude, which our ears then perceive as that increase in loudness. Pretty straightforward at that level.
Yeah, physically, for mechanical sound waves, the ones traveling through the air to our ears, amplitude signifies the maximum displacement of air particles from their normal, undisturbed state.
Like ripples in a pond, but in the air.
Kind of, yeah. Think of it like a domino effect. A sound wave propagates as a series of compressions where air particles are squeezed together, higher pressure, and rarefactions where they spread out, lower pressure. A higher amplitude means a larger displacement of those particles, carrying more energy, resulting in that louder, more impactful sound we hear. It's about the sheer physical force.
But I've heard there are a few distinct ways to measure amplitude. It's not just a simple peak number that tells the whole story, is it?
No, definitely not.
Like there's peak, peak to peak, and then something called RMS. This feels like where it starts to get a little more nuanced.
Precisely. While peak amplitude, like we just said, is the maximum excursion of the wave, that single highest point.
Right.
And peak-to-peak measures the total distance from the highest peak down to the deepest trough. These measurements only capture an instantaneous, fleeting moment.
Like a snapshot.
Exactly, a snapshot. Audio waves, especially complex musical signals, they fluctuate incredibly rapidly. So, for a more useful measure for perceived level, for how loud a sound actually feels to our ears over time, we turn to root mean square, RMS amplitude.
Okay, RMS. That sounds a bit more
Mhm.
mathematical. What exactly is it doing that peak isn't capturing?
Well, RMS essentially computes the equivalent steady amplitude, like a constant level, that would produce the same amount of energy as the actual varying, fluctuating signal does.
Okay, so it's like an average, but a special kind of average.
It's a special kind of average, yeah. For a pure sine wave, its RMS value is about 0.707 times its peak amplitude, which works out to roughly 3 dB lower than the peak level.
Yeah.
But here's the crucial insight for real music. While peak levels are absolutely critical for preventing digital explosions, distortion,
Wait, the nasty stuff.
RMS is the true barometer of how loud a track actually feels to your ears. It's like the difference between a lightning flash instantaneous peak and the rumble of thunder-sustained power, the RMS level.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Our ears integrate sound energy over a brief period. They don't just react to instantaneous spikes, so RMS correlates far better with human loudness perception.
So if I'm getting this right, RMS is about how loud a sound feels. On average, it's consistent energy.
Yep.
Well, peak is strictly about making sure you don't blow up your gear or get horrible digital distortion. Engineers are constantly juggling those two.
That's a perfect way to put it. They're like tightrope walkers, constantly watching peaks to make sure the sound doesn't fall off the cliff into distortion,
Uh-huh.
but also managing RMS to maintain its perceived energy and impact. In practical terms, RMS level represents the perceived or average loudness, while peak level is critical for preventing equipment overload and unrecoverable distortion.
Two sides of the same coin, both essential.
Absolutely, you need both for a balanced, powerful, and clean sound.
Okay, so we've got amplitude, the raw strength of the wave, but then everyone, and I mean everyone in audio, talks in decibels, dBs. Why this specific kind of weird logarithmic scale? Why not just use volts or pascals, the direct physical units?
Yeah.
This seems like a really key point about how we actually hear.
It's fundamental, yeah. And it's one of the first most crucial insights for anyone trying to wrap their head around audio. While amplitude can be expressed in physical units, audio pros almost exclusively use decibels because of how human hearing works.
Okay.
Our ears respond logarithmically to changes in intensity, not linearly. What this means is, for us to perceive a sound as getting, say, twice as loud, the physical energy of that sound actually has to increase by a much larger amount, a specific ratio, not just a simple doubling of voltage or pressure.
Ah, so a small change in decibels can actually sound like a huge jump in loudness. I've definitely noticed that. You nudge the volume a bit and it feels way louder.
Exactly. It highlights how inefficiently our ears perceive linear power increases. The decibel scale cleverly compresses the enormous range of real-world sound pressures. I mean, from the faintest whisper you could possibly imagine to the deafening roar of a jet engine.
Which is a massive range.
Huge. It compresses that into a beautifully manageable scale that perfectly matches our nonlinear perception of loudness changes. We instinctively sense percentage or ratio changes in sound level more than absolute linear changes.
Okay.
Think about this. You need to literally double the electrical power from an amplifier just to get a barely noticeable 3 dB increase in loudness for a pure tone.
Wow. Double the power for just 3 dB.
Yeah, it's a game changer for engineers because it means small dB adjustments in a mix represent massive shifts in energy and often huge shifts in emotional impact.
So it's all about proportional perception. It lines up with how our ears actually work. And it must simplify the math too, right? Instead of multiplying these giant ratios, you're just adding or subtracting dB values. That sounds way more practical in a studio.
That's a massive practical advantage, especially in a complex signal chain. For instance, a common guideline you hear is an increase of plus 10 dB corresponds to a 10-fold increase in sound intensity or power,
Okay.
which the ear perceives as roughly twice as loud. Conversely, a NACA 10 dB reduction sounds about half as loud. Right.
A plus 3 dB change is often considered just noticeable for pure turns, needing double the power, while plus 6 dB is definitely a strong, undeniable increase for many complex sounds, like music. This logarithmic nature lets audio pros handle huge ratios with convenient numbers and simple math. Makes mixing and mastering way more intuitive.
Now, here's a crucial distinction that I know trips up a lot of people, myself included sometimes. Saying it's 6 dBm louder is only half the story. Louder than what?
Exactly.
Unlike saying 5 meters or 10 kilograms, a decibel value on its own is always relative. To make it absolute, to really nail down its physical intensity, you need that little suffix, right? That context marker. That's where dBSPL, dBu, dBV, and all those others come in. And this is where 0 suddenly means something completely different depending on where you are in the audio chain. It's kind of wild. That's a perfect way to put it. Each 0 dD means the reference level for that specific context. Understanding these distinctions is absolutely paramount for effective audio work. For example, 0 dB on a mixing console fader just means no change to the signal level. Output equals input. Unity gain.
Okay.
But 0 dB SPL, as we'll get into, is an absolute sound pressure. E0.00002 pascals, roughly the faintest sound a healthy young ear can detect.
Wow, tiny.
Tiny. Positive or negative dB values then tell you how much above or below that specific reference the signal is. Without that context, a 0 dB measurement is pretty much meaningless.
Okay, so let's navigate these different decibel scales then. Follow our sound on its journey. It can feel like a whole new language at first, this alphabet soup of letters after dB. Let's start with dBSPL, since that's the acoustic realm, what we physically hear in the air before anything gets converted.
Good starting point. dBSPL, sound pressure level, measures acoustic sound pressure in the atmosphere. It's an absolute measurement, reference to that 0 dB SPL point of 0.00002 pascals we just mentioned. That's the universally accepted threshold of human hearing at 1 kilohertz. The quietest sound we can perceive.
You don't need to memorize the Pascal number, I guess, but grasp the sheer range the scale covers.
Exactly. The key insight is the sheer breadth of the sound world this scale compresses, from that near silence all the way up to the deafening roar of a jet engine. This scale lets us consistently quantify the immense range of sound levels we encounter every day.
And the numbers on this scale really put things into perspective.
Yeah.
And show how quickly we get into potentially dangerous territory for hearing. Like a quiet room is maybe around 30 dB SPL.
Yeah, about that.
Normal conversation, maybe 60 to 75 dB SPL. A busy street or a vacuum cleaner can already hit 80 to 90 dB SPL, stuff we hear all the time.
And then it escalates fast. A rock concert often pushes 110, maybe 120 dB SPL. Yeah, and the pain threshold for human hearing is right around 120, 130 dB SPL. That can cause immediate permanent damage from even short exposure. What's really sobering, though, is that prolonged exposure, even to levels as low as 90 dBA over a standard 40-hour work week, can cause permanent, irreversible hearing damage.
That's not even that loud comparatively, like loud machinery or power tools.
Exactly. Think about construction workers, factory workers, even musicians playing regularly without hearing protection. And what's fascinating here mathematically is that each plus 20 dB increase in SPL means the pressure amplitude is 10 times greater.
10 times for 20 dBs.
Yep. So 120 dB SPL is about 1 pascal of pressure. That's 100 times the pressure of 100 dB SPL, which is only 0.1 pascal. This exponential increase in energy is why a seemingly small decibel jump represents a massive, potentially dangerous increase in actual physical sound pressure on your eardrums.
That really puts it in perspective. Okay, so that's the acoustic realm. dB SPL, pressure hitting our ears. But now, imagine that sound, say, a guitar chord, gets picked up by a microphone. It's transformed into an electrical signal flowing through cables and circuits. How do we measure its strength now as it flows through wires and into studio gear? This is where dBu, dBV, dBm come in, right? The electrical decibels.
You've hit the perfect next step in our sounds journey. In the electrical domain, these decibel units measure voltage or power levels within the audio equipment itself. First, dBu. It's referenced such that 0 dBu equals 0.775 volts RMS.
0.775 volts. That seems like a really specific kind of random number. Is there a reason for that?
There is actually. It's historical. That specific voltage was chosen because it corresponds to 1 milliwatt of power dissipated into a 600 ohm load, which was a standard impedance used in early telecommunications and broadcasting. So its roots are deep in the legacy of audio technology.
Okay, so dBu is primarily for professional audio gear then.
Yeah.
The serious stuff you'd find in a recording studio or a broadcast facility.
Exactly. Professional audio equipment, mixing consoles, signal processors, high-end preamps typically operates at a nominal line level of plus 4 dBu. That works out to about 1.23 volts RMS. This level provides a strong, healthy signal that's robust against noise interference, but it's still well below the clipping point of most Pro gear, giving it plenty of headroom.
And dBV is the consumer counterpart. For your home stereo, CD player, that kind of thing. This feels like where a lot of people might run into connection problems without realizing why.
Yes, exactly. 0 dBV is reference to a much simpler 1.0 volt RMS, a nice round number. It's commonly used for consumer audio equipment, home stereos, CD players, older cassette decks, even some semi-pro gear. These usually operate at a lower nominal level of -10 dBV, which is about 0.316 volts RMS. This lower level is generally chosen for cost reasons and simplicity in consumer devices.
So there's a pretty significant level difference between pro and consumer gear. I've heard that +4 dBu is about 12 dBo hotter or louder than -10 dBV, even though the numbers themselves look like there's a 14 dB difference. That can be confusing.
That's a really common point of confusion, yeah, and it's important to get it straight. The numerical difference is misleading because their 0 dB reference points are totally different voltages. To compare them directly, apples to apples, you have to convert. And when you do, -10 dBV actually works out to be equivalent to approximately -7.78 dBu.
Okay.
So the true difference between a professional +4 dBu signal and a consumer -10 dBu signal is indeed around 11.78 dBb, which we usually just round to about 12 dB for convenience.
And that 12 dBb difference is significant. That's like quite a few clicks on a volume knob.
Oh, it's a big difference. And if you don't manage that mismatch when connecting gear, you get immediate problems. Noise or distortion, guaranteed.
How so?
Well, if you try to send a hot professional level signal, +4 dBu, directly into a consumer device designed for the much lower -10 dBV level, without turning down the pro output or using a special signal pad,
You'll overload it.
you will almost certainly overload and distort the consumer device's input stage. It'll sound harsh, clipped, just terrible. Conversely, if you connect a consumer device like your phone's headphone jack outputting -10 dBV directly to a professional input expecting a hefty +4 dBu signal.
It'll be way too quiet.
Way too quiet. You'll have to crank the input gain on the professional device significantly, maybe using a signal level driver or just the preamp gain. The major downside of boosting a weak consumer signal like that is that you also amplify the noise flow, the inherent hiss and hum that was already present in the consumer device's output,
Right.
which can seriously degrade your audio quality, making your otherwise pristine recording sound hissy or muddy. Proper level matching is crucial.
We also briefly mentioned dBm earlier. Is that still widely used in studios?
dBm, reference to 1 milliwatt MW of power, historically into that 600 ohm load, is less common in everyday studio gear these days compared to dBu and dBV. It's still used in specific applications, though. Telecommunications, RF, that's radio frequency audio transmission like wireless mics, or sometimes when explicitly rating the power output of certain amplifiers. But for routing audio signals via voltage in a typical studio, dBu and dBV are your main players.
Okay, got it. So we've gone from the air, dBSPL, to electrical signals flowing through wires, dBu, dBV. Now that electrical signal gets fed into an analog to digital converter, the ADC, and we hit the absolute ceiling, the unforgiving world of digital audio, dBFS and dBTP. This is where things get really rigid, isn't it? Like zero room for error.
Yes, the digital audio domain operates with a very strict binary set of rules. dBFS, or decibels full scale, measures levels relative to the absolute maximum achievable digital level. By definition, 0 dBFS is the highest possible level. It represents a digital sample where all the available bits are set to 1, meaning the digital word representing that sample is maxed out.
It's the absolute hard ceiling.
It is the absolute hard ceiling in a fixed point digital system. There's literally no above 0 dBFS in this world. It doesn't exist numerically.
So if 0 dBFS is the absolute top, then all your measurements in dBFS have to be negative numbers because you can't go above 0.
Exactly.
And if your signal hits that ceiling, that's digital clipping. And that is universally considered bad, right? Really bad.
Oh, unequivocally bad. If any part of your audio signal attempts to exceed 0 dBFS, it results in harsh, unrecoverable, and musically completely undesirable distortion. The waveform is literally squared off or chopped off because there's simply no more numerical headroom, no more bits to represent the original shape of the wave above that point.
And it sounds awful.
It sounds awful, like a buzzing, crackling, nasty digital noise. That's why engineers absolutely must leave adequate headroom below 0 dBFS during recording and mixing. For instance, aiming for peaks hitting maybe -6 dBFS or even lower is common practice. For the final mastering stage, a target peak level of maybe Mega 0.1 to negative 0.3 dBFS is often used, still leaving just a tiny sliver of space below the absolute ceiling.
That makes total sense. But what about this inner sample clipping I've heard about? That sounds sneaky. That's where dBKP comes in, right? True peak meters. It sounds like even if your regular dBFS meter isn't showing clipping, you could still be in trouble down the line.
That's an excellent point and a really critical development in modern audio. What's truly insightful here is that standard dBFS meters, the ones built into most DAWs by default, measure discrete digital samples. They show you the level at those specific sample points in time. However, during the process of digital to analog conversion, when your computer or audio interface reconstructs the smooth, continuous analog waveform that actually exists between those discrete samples, that reconstructed waveform can actually peak higher than 0 dBFS, even if the individual digital samples themselves were technically below the ceiling.
Whoa. How does that happen?
It's due to the interpolation process used in D to A conversion. Think of connecting the dots. If two adjacent sample points are very high but still below 0 dBFS, the smooth curve connecting them might actually overshoot 0 dBFS momentarily. This is called intersample clipping, or ISP.
And it can cause audible distortion on playback, especially on cheaper consumer devices, even though your DW meter looked fine.
Exactly. Especially on devices with less sophisticated D to A converters, those intersample peaks can cause audible clicks, pops, or distortion that your standard peak meter never warned you about.
So the true peak meter is the solution. It catches those invisible peaks between the samples.
It does. A true peak meter, which measures in dBTP, decibels true peak, uses a process called oversampling. It essentially looks at the signal at a much higher resolution, effectively looking between the samples to accurately measure the level of that reconstructed analog waveform. It catches those hidden peaks.
And that's why modern standards mandate it.
Precisely. Modern broadcast and streaming standards like EBU R128 and ITU BS1770 now mandate that the true peak level must not exceed a certain limit, typically -1 dBTP or sometimes even -2 dBTP. This ensures clean, distortion-free playback on all devices, regardless of the quality of their D to A converters. It's become an absolute critical part of the final mastering stage, ensuring your music sounds good everywhere without nasty surprises.
And this ties into digital dynamic range, which is directly related to bit depth, right? Like the difference between 16-bit audio, like on CDs, and 24-bit audio, which is the standard now. This is where digital recording really shows its power.
Exactly. This is where the power and flexibility of digital audio truly shine. There's a handy rule of thumb, a 6 dB per bit rule. It states that each additional bit you use in digital audio adds approximately 6 dBs of dynamic range.
Okay.
So a 16-bit system, which is what standard CDs use, has about 96 dBs of dynamic range. That means its lowest possible discernible signal level, its noise floor essentially, is way down at 96 dBFS, which is pretty good.
But 24-bit is way better.
Way better. A 24-bit system, which is the professional standard today for recording and mixing, offers a massive theoretical dynamic range of about 144 dBs. This enormous range allows engineers to record at much lower average levels, for example, targeting peaks around a -18 dBFS or even -20 dBFS, leaving incredibly generous headroom below 0 dBFS without worrying at all about the signal getting lost in the noise floor, because the noise floor in a 24-bit system is incredibly low, NAGNA 144 dBFS. This means pristine audio quality, huge flexibility for processing later, like compression, which raises low levels, without ever risking hitting that unforgiving 0 dBFS ceiling during the initial recording. It's a massive advantage.
Okay, this is truly fascinating, but I admit it's also a little dizzying, all these different 0 dB points, dBSBL, dBU, dBV, dBFS, dBTP. It feels like each one opens up an entirely new universe of measurement. It's incredible that 0 means something completely different in each context, like each domain has its own unique ground zero.
Yeah.
Could you help us just quickly summarize what each 0 dB point really signifies to kind of cement it and help avoid mixing apples and oranges?
Absolutely. Let's do a quick lightning round summary, because you're right. This is where many misunderstandings start. So what 0 dB truly means in context, 0 dB SPL. This isn't just a number, it's the threshold of human hearing at 1 kilohertz. The faintest whisper a healthy ear can possibly detect. It's the literal start of audible sound for us.
Okay.
0 dBu. This is a professional electrical reference representing 0.775 volts RMS. Think of it as the standard working level for high-end studio gear.
Pro-level voltage.
0 dBV. This is a consumer electrical reference representing 1.0 volt RMS. It's the typical operating level for your home stereo or portable device.
Consumer voltage.
0 dBm. This is a power reference representing 1 milliwatt of power, usually into a specific impedance like 600 ohms. Less common in modern studios, but vital for specific legacy and RF applications.
Power, not voltage.
0 dBFS. This isn't just a number, it's the unyielding digital cliff face, the absolute maximum digital level possible. Beyond this lies immediate, harsh clipping. It's the digital system saying, stop,
The hard limit.
0 dBTP. This is the true peak maximum for the reconstructed analog waveform after D to A conversion. It's the point beyond which intersample clipping can occur, causing distortion even if your standard digital peak meters looked perfectly fine.
The hidden peak limit.
Exactly. So each 0 dB means something entirely different, referencing a different physical quantity or system limit. Understanding these distinctions is paramount for effective audio work, ensuring you're always speaking the right language for the right part of the audio chain.
That makes it crystal clear.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we've defined amplitude, explored all these different decibel scales, air, electrical, digital, but here's the wild card, our ears. They aren't perfect scientific instruments, are they? They're marvelously complex, but also kind of quirky.
Very quirky.
This leads us to the fascinating world of how our brains actually interpret those amplitude changes. Psychoacoustics. And this is where things get surprisingly subjective and deeply artistic. We need to talk of those famous Fletcher-Munson curves.
You're absolutely right. This is where physics meets biology and psychology, and it profoundly impacts everything about how we mix and master music. Human hearing is fundamentally not linear across the frequency spectrum. Our sensitivity varies significantly, not just with frequency, but also, crucially, with the overall loudness level we're listening at.
Right.
This nonlinear response is precisely what the Fletcher-Munson curves, now more formally known as the ISO 226 equal loudness contours, visually depict. The core insight, the big takeaway, is this. Our ears are most sensitive in the mid-range frequencies, specifically around 2 kilohertz to 5 kilohertz.
Which is where human speech sits, mostly.
It's no coincidence. Makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, right? It makes us incredibly efficient at understanding speech.
So this explains why, if you're listening to music really quietly, the bass and the very high trebles seem to just fall away. They almost disappear. That's the Fletcher-Munson effect in action, isn't it? Music sounds thin at low volumes.
Precisely. At very low frequencies, the deep bass, and very high frequencies, the airy treble, the ear is dramatically less sensitive, especially when the overall listening volume is low. This means that at lower playback volumes, music tends to sound thinner or scooped out in the middle because the bass and the extreme treble seem to drop off in perceived loudness, even if their actual decibel SPL hasn't changed relative to the mids.
So you need way more energy in the bass to feel as loud as the mids at low volumes.
Way more. For a 50 hertz bass tone to sound subjectively as loud as a 1 kilohertz mid-range tone when you're listening quietly, that bass tone must be played at a much, much higher dB SPL. This is a constant phenomenon that engineers are always battling or using creatively.
This instantly explains why old stereos often had that loudness button. I always wondered what that really did.
Exactly. That button wasn't just a gimmick, it was psychoacoustics in action. It typically boosted the low and high frequencies when the volume knob was turned down, counteracting our ears' natural drop-off in sensitivity in those ranges at quiet levels.
Making the music sound full-bodied again, even when played softly.
That was the idea. For audio engineers, understanding this phenomenon is absolutely crucial. If you try to mix a song while listening at a very low volume, trying to get everything balanced,
You'll instinctively crank the bass and treble to make it sound right to you at that low volume.
exactly. You might overboost the bass and treble to compensate for your ears' insensitivity. The result. When that same mix is played back at a normal, healthy volume, it will sound overly boomy and bloated in the bass, or maybe too bright and harsh in the treble. It won't translate. This is why experienced engineers learn to mix at a moderate, consistent listening level, typically calibrated somewhere between 65 and 75 dBs SPL, is common, and to be constantly aware of how loudness affects tonal balance. It profoundly underlines the importance of reference monitoring, checking your mix at different playback levels, and on different speaker systems.
So our ears are imperfect, frequency-dependent instruments. What about the smallest change in level we can actually hear? The just noticeable difference, or JND. This sounds like a key metric for thinking about subtle adjustments.
It truly is. It tells us the threshold of our perception. For simple sounds like pure tones in a quiet, controlled laboratory environment, the J&D for loudness is often cited as being around 1 dB.
Just 1 dB.
Yeah, under optimal conditions, a 1 dB volume increase is just barely discernible. It's a subtle shift you might just catch if you're really listening for it. Changes smaller than that are usually only perceived in highly controlled scientific listening tests.
But in the real world, with complex music,
Right. With more complex material like a full music mix or in noisier real-world listening environments, the ear is less sensitive to small changes. Differences might need to be on the order of 2 dB, maybe even 3 dB, for casual listeners to reliably notice a change in level. Of course, skilled, highly trained audio engineers, especially mastering engineers, can sometimes detect differences of 0.5 dBb or even less in critical situations. But it tells us that not every tiny dB nudge matters equally to every listener. But in a critical mix, those small 1 to 2 dB changes can absolutely be the difference between something feeling right or slightly off.
and what about that rule of thumb we mentioned earlier that plus 10 dB is perceived as twice as loud? Is that always perfectly true, or is it more of a guideline?
It's a very common guideline and a very useful heuristic, especially when talking about pure tones around the mid-frequencies where our hearing is sensitive. Generally, yes, a plus 10 dB change is perceived as roughly twice as loud or half as loud for a negative 10 dB reduction. And remember that plus 10 dB requires 10 times the electrical power or acoustic intensity.
10 times the power to feel twice as loud.
Crazy. It is. However, it's not always precisely 10 dB. Some studies and many listeners' subjective experience with complex broadband sounds like music suggest that plus 6 dB can sometimes feel about double in loudness. Plus 6 dB is definitely a very strong, noticeable increase. The main point, the key takeaway is this. Our loudness perception is highly compressive. It takes genuinely large increases in physical power or intensity to make appreciable subjective differences in loudness. And this is precisely why the decibel scale is so incredibly handy. It compresses these enormous, unwieldy physical ranges into manageable, human perceptible numbers that align beautifully with how we actually hear loudness changes.
So it's not just amplitude, measured in dB, and frequency, interacting via Fletcher-Munson, that affect perceived loudness. Duration plays a role, too, and even the complexity or spectral makeup of the sound itself. Like, a short, loud peak might not actually sound as loud as a longer, slightly quieter, sustained sound. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. What's fascinating here is that our auditory system integrates sound energy over time, typically over a window of a few hundred milliseconds. So a longer sound is perceived as louder than a brief sound of the exact same instantaneous peak amplitude.
Because the ear gathers more energy over time.
Essentially, yes. Short, high-amplitude peaks, often called transients, think the initial crack of a snare drum or a quick cymbal hit contributes surprisingly little to our overall perceived loudness because they just don't contain enough energy over a sustained period for our auditory system to register them as truly loud events. They provide definition and punch, but not sustained loudness. This is another key reason why RMS meters, which measure average energy, are so much more important for gauging perceived loudness than just looking at peak meters.
And complexity. You mentioned things like distortion. That can make something feel louder, even if the measured SPL or peak level is the same. It adds a certain grit or presence.
Absolutely. This is a really powerful artistic tool used constantly in music production. A sound with multiple harmonics or complex frequency content, like an overdriven guitar amp, a synth with lots of upper harmonics, or even a slightly distorted vocal, will often be perceived as significantly louder and more present than a pure, simple sine tone played at the exact same sound pressure level, SPL.
Why is that?
Well, distortion, for instance, fundamentally works by adding new harmonic content to the original signal. These harmonics are often multiples of the fundamental frequency. Crucially, these new harmonics often fall into the mid-range frequencies, precisely where our ears are most sensitive, according to Fletcher-Munson.
Ah, so it's adding energy right where we hear it best.
Exactly. This can make the distorted sound feel significantly louder, sharper, buzzier, more aggressive, adding presence and energy that helps it cut through a dense mix, even if the overall sound pressure level or peak level hasn't actually increased by much, or maybe even at all. It's a key reason why certain sounds just grab your attention.
And this leads us nicely to the idea of phones and sones. I know these are older psychoacoustic units, but they were early attempts to scientifically quantify perceived loudness, right? And they were direct precursors to the modern loudness units like LUFS that we use today.
Yeah.
How do they fit into this picture of human perception?
Phones and sones are indeed crucial historical and conceptual stepping stones. They were developed specifically to bridge that gap between objective physical measurements, like dBSPL, and our subjective frequency-dependent perceptions of loudness. A phone is our first real step into quantifying perceived loudness level, directly accounting for those equal loudness contours.
How does it work?
Imagine our reference sound, a pure 1 kilohertz sine wave. If we play that tone at 60 dB SPL, that loudness level is defined by convention as 60 phones. Now let's take a deep bass note, say down at 50 hertz. If we want that 50 hertz note to sound just as loud to our ears as that 60 phone reference tone at 1 kilohertz, our ears are going to demand that the bass note be played at a much, much higher physical dB SPL level simply because of our lower sensitivity to bass frequencies, the Fletcher-Munson effect.
Right.
The font scale essentially tells us exactly how many dB SPL are needed at any frequency to match the perceived loudness of that 1 kilohertz reference tone. So a sound level of 60 phones means sounds equally as loud as a 1 kilohertz tone at 60 dB SPL, regardless of the actual frequency of the sound being measured. It maps loudness perception across frequencies.
And Sones take it a step further, trying to make it more intuitive.
Yes, exactly. While Fonz map equal loudness levels, the Sohn scale attempts to quantify loudness magnitude in a way that feels linear to our perception. It provides a more intuitive scale. One Sohn is defined as the perceived loudness of a 1 kilohertz tone played at 40 dB SPL, which is by definition also 40 phones.
Okay, 1 Sohn equal 40 phones.
Right. And the key insight here is that the Sohn scale is designed so that doubling the Sohn value directly represents a perceived doubling of loudness. So 2 Sohns sounds twice as loud as 1 Sohn, and 4 Sohns sounds twice as loud as 2 Sohns, and so on. It tries to linearize our subjective perception. While not perfect, these core principles, using frequency weighting based on equal loudness contours, accounting for temporal integration, how loudness builds over time, and trying to create scales that match perception, all explored through the development of Fonz and Sohns, are the direct conceptual precursors to modern, highly sophisticated, psychoacoustically informed loudness measurements like LUFS, which are now standard in broadcasting and streaming. They really set the stage for how we measure and understand perceived loudness today.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we understand the foundations of amplitude, the different decibel scales, and crucially, how our quirky ears perceive sound differently based on frequency, level, and duration. Now, let's get into the engineer's toolkit, the practical application of all this knowledge. How do they actually measure and manage these signals day to day in the studio? We hear a lot about VU meters and PPMs, these different types of meters, which seem to have very different jobs.
Metering methodologies are absolutely critical tools for any audio professional. You need to know what your meters are telling you. Historically, especially in the analog days, VU meters, volume unit meters, and PPMs, peak program meters, were the two primary types, and crucially, each provides a different complementary piece of the puzzle about the signal's level.
Let's start with VU meters. Those are the classic ones, right? With the gently swaying needle. They always look so smooth. They don't seem to twitch to every little transient sound.
Exactly. That smooth, slow movement is their defining characteristic. A VU meter is essentially an averaging meter. It's designed specifically to mimic the human ear's perception of overall loudness by responding relatively slowly to changes in the signal level.
How slow is slow?
Technically, they have a standardized integration time or rise time of about 300 milliseconds to reach 0 VU on a steady sine wave tone. This sluggishness is entirely intentional. It averages or integrates the sound level over that brief moment, much like our ears do when we perceive the overall loudness or energy of a sound, rather than reacting to every tiny peak.
So they're good for showing the general level, the vibe.
Yeah, they're great for showing the approximate consistent loudness or the relative balance between different elements in a mix. For instance, making sure a vocalist's level remains generally consistent throughout a song, even if they have loud and soft moments. Historically, in professional analog gear, 0 VU was often calibrated to correspond to the nominal operating level, like +4 dBu. And crucially, there was usually significant headroom, often anywhere from 8 dB up to 20 dB above that 0 VU mark in the analog system before actual nasty distortion occurred.
So 0 VU wasn't the danger zone, it was the target zone.
Exactly. It meant engineers had a comfortable buffer zone. They could let the needle occasionally swing above 0 VU on peaks without panicking, knowing the system could handle it gracefully, maybe even adding a bit of nice analog saturation.
But I heard they can be quite dangerous to rely on solely, especially in the unforgiving digital era. Why is that? What's the catch with VU meters?
This is a really critical point, and one that tripped up many engineers transitioning from analog workflows to digital ones. A pure VU meter, because of its slow averaging nature, will not reliably warn you about fast transient overloads. A short, sharp spike in the signal like the crack of a snare drum, a loud cymbal crash, or a plosive P sound in a vocal.
Stuff that happens all the time in music.
All the time. That spike can come and go much faster than the meter's 300 meters integration time. The needle might barely twitch or only flick up slightly, even though that transient peak could be high enough to instantly clip a digital converter and cause that horrible, unrecoverable distortion we talked about.
Ouch. So you could be clipping constantly without the VU meter really showing it.
You absolutely could. In the analog days, engineers learned to interpret VU meters and leave appropriate safety margins based on experience. But in the unforgiving digital realm, where 0 dBFS is an absolute brick wall with no forgiveness, relying solely on VU meters for peak level indication can lead to severe and constant clipping if you're not careful. They tell you about average loudness, not peak excursions.
Okay, so that's where PPMs come in. Peak program meters. They're designed specifically to catch those fast, sudden transients that VU meters miss.
Yes, precisely. A peak program meter, PPM, is designed with the opposite philosophy. Its primary job is to catch those fast transients and accurately display the peak level of the signal, warning you about potential overloads. Unlike a VU meter, a true PPM has a very fast rise time, typically standardized somewhere between 4 and 10 milliseconds, allowing it to react almost instantaneously to peaks.
So it sees the lightning flash, not just the thunder rumble.
Perfect analogy again. It sees the flash. They usually have a slower fall time or decay time, though, often over 1.5 seconds, which is intentional. It holds the peak reading long enough for your eyes to actually register it clearly before the indicator falls back down. This slower fall reduces eye fatigue when watching the meters constantly.
And in modern digital systems, the standard meters we see in our DAWs are usually peak reading, right? Measured in dBFS.
Yes, the default channel meters and master bus meters in virtually all modern digital audio workstations, DAWs, are peak reading meters, calibrated in dBFS with 0 dBFS right at the very top of the scale. If that peak meter hits the top, it signals immediate digital clipping, often accompanied by a red indicator light or segment that stays lit for a moment, a peak hold, to make absolutely sure you saw the overload warning.
But the downside of only looking at peak meters is that they don't really convey perceived loudness very well, do they? You could have a track with occasional sharp peaks hitting 0 dBFS, maybe like a really dynamic acoustic recording, but it might actually sound much quieter on average than a heavily oppressed pop track whose peaks only reach, say, 3 dBFS, but whose average level is way higher.
You've hit on the core problem with relying solely on peak meters for judging perceived loudness. That track with the occasional 0 dBFS peaks might sound quiet and dynamic, while the track peaking lower but constantly hitting that lower peak level due to heavy compression will sound much louder and more in your face. Our ears, as we discussed, respond more to the average level, the sustained energy, more like what a VU meter shows, or RMS, than to those instantaneous fleeting peaks.
And this disconnect is where the loudness war really started to cause confusion and problems, wasn't it? People chasing peak levels without understanding perceived loudness.
Absolutely. It led directly to the loudness war, where engineers increasingly used heavy compression and limiting simply to push the average level higher and higher, making the track appear louder on those standard peak meters by reducing the difference between peak and average, often sacrificing dynamics and sound quality in the process. Modern metering systems, thankfully, recognize these limitations of using only peak or only VU meters. Many DAWs now offer integrated meters that show both peak, often as a thin bar or dot, and average RMS level as a thicker bar or different color simultaneously.
Giving you both pieces of information at once.
Exactly. And even better, we now have LUFS, loudness units full-scale meters. These are sophisticated meters mandated by broadcast and streaming standards like EBU R128 and ITU BS 1770 that track integrated loudness over time using psychoacoustic weighting, specifically K weighting, to give a much more accurate representation of actual perceived loudness, aligning closely with how humans hear.
So the modern best practice, the ideal approach, is really using a combination of meters. Watch your peaks, especially true peaks, dBTP, to avoid any technical clipping or distortion, but manage your average levels using RMS, or even better, LUFS, to control the perceived loudness and dynamics.
Absolutely. That's the professional standard now. You need both perspectives. Watch your true peak meter, aiming for below MIGA 1 dBTP typically, to ensure you avoid intersample clipping and meet delivery specs. And monitor your LUFS levels, integrated short-term momentary, to gauge perceived loudness, manage dynamics, and hit the target levels required by streaming platforms or broadcasters, like negative 14 LUFS integrated for Spotify, or negative 23 LUFS for EBU broadcast. A good traditional practice in your studio is also still valid. Set levels so that your main peak meters, dBFS, never hit zero, maintaining a safety margin, e.g. peaking around negative 6 dBFS in the mix, and ensure your VU meters, if you use them, or VU-style plugins, hover comfortably around their zero mark on average, indicating a robust, healthy signal level that isn't overly squashed or dangerously close to clipping. It's about using the right tool for the right job.
And this brings us right back to the critical concept of headroom, avoiding distortion. What exactly is headroom, again in simple terms, and why is it so utterly non-negotiable, especially in digital audio?
Headroom is essentially your safety margin. Think of it as the breathing room in your audio signal. It's the buffer, the available space, between your typical operating signal level, your average or nominal level, and the absolute maximum level your system can handle without introducing unwanted distortion or clipping.
So in analog, it was the space above 0 VU before things got nasty.
Pretty much, yeah. It was the dB difference between your nominal level, like plus 4 dB or 0 VU, and the point where the analog circuitry started to audibly distort or saturate unpleasantly. In digital, it's even more critical. It's the crucial dB difference between your highest peak signal level, hopefully measured with a true peak meter, and that absolute unforgiving 0 dBFS ceiling. Maintaining adequate headroom is absolutely critical for preserving audio fidelity, preventing that harsh digital clipping, allowing space for downstream processing, and generally making your life easier.
So in digital, 0 dBFS is that absolute hard limit. We've established that. If you exceed it, even for a single sample, you get that immediate, harsh, unmusical digital clipping. It's like hitting a brick wall at full speed. There's no grace.
That's exactly it. It's often referred to as the digital cliff for a reason. If any part of your signal waveform tries to numerically exceed the maximum value representable by the available bits, which is 0 dBFS, it results in immediate, harsh, unrecoverable, and musically completely undesirable distortion. The waveform is brutally squared off or flattened at the top and/or bottom because there is simply no more digital numbers available to represent the original wave shape above that point.
And it sounds terrible, like pure digital garbage.
It sounds terrible, like a buzzing, crackling, nasty noise that often bears little resemblance to the original sound. And once it's printed into the digital audio file, it's virtually impossible to remove cleanly without causing other artifacts. That's why best practice in digital is always to leave several dB of headroom below 0 dBFS during recording and mixing. For example, targeting peaks no higher than negative 6 dBFS during mixing is a very common and safe approach. For 24-bit recording, you can even aim lower, maybe peaks around negative 12 dBFS or even down towards negative 18 dBFS or negative 20 dBFS.
Because 24-bit has so much dynamic range, the noise floor is super low anyway.
Exactly. Recording lower in 24-bit still gives you a fantastic signal-to-noise ratio but leaves incredibly generous headroom. This prevents any possibility of intersample peaks causing problems later, avoids accidental overshoots when you start adding plugins, EQs and compressors can increase peak levels, and provides crucial space for the mastering engineer to do their final shaping and level optimization without bumping into the ceiling. Always leave headroom.
But analog is different. We touched on this. You can push analog gear into saturation, past its nominal 0 VU level, and it can even sound good, right? That's where the whole mystique of tape warmth or tube saturation that everyone chases comes from. It's a much more graceful kind of overload.
It is, and what's fascinating here is how gracefully analog systems can overload compared to the brutal cliff of digital. As analog gear, think tape machines, tube amplifiers, audio transformers, approaches its maximum operating level, it doesn't just suddenly clip hard. Instead, it begins to saturate gradually.
So it bends rather than breaks.
That's a great way to think about it. Instead of brutally chopping off the peaks like digital clipping, analog saturation softly rounds them off, effectively acting like a gentle natural compressor. And importantly, as it saturates, it adds harmonic distortion. But crucially, it tends to add primarily lower-order harmonics, second and third-order harmonics, which our ears often perceive as musically pleasant, adding richness, thickness, warmth, or grit.
That's the magic sauce.
That's the magic sauce of that coveted tape warmth or tube mojo that so many engineers and musicians adore. Many classic rock recordings, for example, intentionally hit the analog tape machine at levels like +3, +6, or even +7 VU on the loudest peaks, specifically to get that desirable natural compression effect and that rich, harmonically complex character that tape imparts when pushed. Similarly, an analog mixing console might be designed to operate nominally at +4 dBO, but might not actually hard clip until way up at +24 dBU or even higher, providing a massive 20 dB or more of clean headroom before significant distortion sets in.
You had room to push things.
So analog soft clipping and saturation versus digital hard clipping, that's an immense fundamental difference in both sound quality and artistic application. You might want one, but you definitely don't want the other. It's an immense difference, night and day. Analog soft clipping creates a natural, often desirable compression effect, adding character, density, and warmth. Digital hard clipping, by contrast, is immediate, unmusical, sounds broken, and is universally considered undesirable, unless used intentionally as a very aggressive distortion effect, which is rare and requires careful handling. This fundamental difference is why many experienced engineers adopt workflows where they align their analog and digital scales carefully. For example, calibrating their system so that 0 VU on their analog gear corresponds to a level like -18 dBFS or -20 dBFS in their digital system.
Creating a deliberate safety buffer in digital.
Exactly. It creates a generous safety buffer. It ensures that even if an analog signal pushes into that pleasing, graceful saturation on the way in, it's unlikely to instantly clip the digital converter on the way into the DAW. This allows digital systems to capture some of that desirable analog behavior without actually destroying the audio with digital overs.
So the practical tip, the mantra is always, always monitor your headroom, especially in digital. If you see those red lights flashing on your digital meters, turn things down immediately. Better too low than clipped.
Absolutely. It's the golden rule of digital audio. It is always better to record a signal a little too low than too high. If it's too low, but still well above the noise floor, which is easy in 24-bit, you can boost it cleanly later in your DAW without adding appreciable noise or distortion. But once a digital signal clips at the converter stage, it's fundamentally damaged. That information is lost forever, and it's essentially unrecoverable in a transparent way. Good gain staging and maintaining healthy headroom preserves fidelity, provides breathing room for dynamics, makes mixing much easier, and makes your mastering engineer very happy. Many experienced mixers will intentionally set their overall gain structure so the final mix bus peaks comfortably around -6 dBFS or even less, giving the mastering engineer ample room to work their magic without fighting previously introduced distortion or lack of space.
This brings us directly to dynamic range itself and the essential processors used to control it. Compressors and limiters. These are often misunderstood, sometimes seen as just loudness machines, but they're incredibly powerful fundamental tools for shaping the emotional contour and impact of music. What exactly is dynamic range in this context? We hear the term a lot.
Dynamic range is a term that actually has two closely related but distinct meanings in audio, and it's important to differentiate them. First, when we talk about the dynamic range of a piece of audio content, like a song or a recording, it's the difference, measured in decibels, between the quietest sound and the loudest sound within that specific piece of material.
Okay, the range within the music itself.
Exactly. For example, a classical orchestral piece might have a very wide dynamic range, perhaps 30 dBs or even more, going from whisper quiet passages, pianissimo, that build suspense, to thunderous full orchestra moments, fortissimo, that provide explosive impact. A heavily compressed modern pop track, on the other hand, might have a very narrow dynamic range, maybe less than 68 dBs, between its quietest and loudest moments. The second meaning is the dynamic range of a playback system or an audio medium, like a CD, a digital file, or an analog tape. In this case, it's the span, again in dB, between the lowest reproducible level, limited by the system's inherent noise floor, and the highest level it can handle without significant distortion or clipping. Both concepts are crucial for understanding the limitations and possibilities of recording, mixing, and reproducing sound.
And compressors are the main tool engineers use to control the dynamic range of the content, right? To reduce that difference between the loud and soft parts, making the quiet parts effectively louder and the loud parts quieter relative to each other.
Yes, that's their primary function and why they are perhaps the most used and sometimes abused processor in audio. A compressor works by automatically reducing the level or gain of any part of the audio signal that exceeds a user-defined level, called the threshold. It effectively tames the loud peaks, bringing them down.
So it makes the loud bits less loud?
Right. Then, typically, you use what's called makeup gain to boost the entire compressed signal back up. The net result is that the original loud parts are now closer in level to the original quiet parts. The difference between loud and soft is smaller, the dynamic range has been reduced or compressed.
And this makes things sound more consistent, more controlled.
Exactly. Skilled, subtle use of compression can work wonders. It can even out a dynamic performance, for instance, smoothing out a vocalist who sometimes whispers and sometimes shouts, ensuring their voice remains clear and present throughout the track without either overwhelming the listener or disappearing into the background during quiet moments. It helps create a more consistent listening experience.
And there are all those complex sounding parameters that make compressors so versatile, but also sometimes confusing. Threshold,
Yeah.
ratio, attack, release, and knee. These are what allow engineers to really sculpt the sound so precisely, aren't they? It's not just one knob.
Not at all. These are the core controls that transform a compressor from a simple level controller into a powerful artistic tool for shaping dynamics and even tone. Let's break those down quickly. The threshold is the level in dB above which the compression begins. Any signal below this level passes through completely untouched. But as soon as the signal crosses the threshold, the compressor activates and starts reducing gain.
So that's the trigger point.
Exactly. The ratio determines how much gain reduction occurs once the signal is above the threshold. A ratio of 4.1, 4 to 1, means that if the input signal goes 4 dB over the threshold, the output signal will only be allowed to go 1 dB over the threshold. Higher ratios mean more aggressive compression, lower ratios are gentler.
How hard it pushes down.
Precisely.
And then attack and release those control the timing of that compression, right? How quickly it reacts and lets go. This seems crucial for the feel of the sound.
Absolutely crucial. These control the envelope of the compression and have a huge impact on the perceived character. Attack time, measured in milliseconds, is how quickly the compressor reacts and starts reducing gain once the signal crosses the threshold. A super fast attack, like 1 meter or less, will clamp down almost instantly, which can make a drum hit sound thinner or less impactful by squashing its initial sharp transient, but it can also provide very tight control over sudden loud notes in a vocal. A slower attack, say 10-30 meters or more, intentionally lets that initial thwack or pop of the transient through before the compression kicks in, which can preserve or even enhance the sense of punch and impact while still controlling the sustained part of the sound.
So attack shapes the start of the sound.
Yes. And release time also, usually in M's, sometimes seconds, is how long it takes for the compressor to let go and stop reducing gain once the signal drops back below the threshold. This is equally critical for the feel. Too fast to release, and you can sometimes hear the background noise or room sound rushing up unnaturally between notes or phrases, creating an audible breathing or pumping effect. Sometimes a desired artistic effect, especially in electronic music, but often distracting or jarring if overdone. Too slow a release, and the compressor might just stay on too long, clamping down on subsequent sounds, even if they aren't loud, making everything sound consistently squashed, lifeless, and lacking dynamic variation.
Finding the right attack and release seems like a real art.
It really is. It depends entirely on the source material and the desired effect.
And the knee. That sounds like a subtle control, controlling the transition.
It is subtle but important for the character of the compression. It controls how the compressor transitions from off, below threshold, to on, reducing gain. A hard knee means the transition is abrupt. As soon as the signal hits the threshold, the full compression ratio is applied instantly. This gives a very obvious, sometimes aggressive compression effect. A soft knee provides a much smoother, more gradual transition. The compression starts gently before the signal actually reaches the threshold and gradually increases up to the full ratio after it crosses the threshold. This allows for much more transparent, less audible compression, which is often preferred for vocals, acoustic instruments, or applying subtle control to an entire mix bus, often called glue. It makes the compression less noticeable while still doing its job of controlling dynamics. These parameters, used creatively and thoughtfully, allow compressors not just to control level, but to shape the tonal envelope, emphasize or de-emphasize transients, add sustain, and truly glue individual tracks together or give an entire mix cohesion and punch.
But there's always that downside, right? That eternal trade-off we keep coming back to. Overcompression. You can make music sound lifeless, flat, squashed things listeners often complain about, even if they don't know the technical term.
That's the eternal trade-off, absolutely, and the core challenge that defines skilled mixing and mastering. While compression is an indispensable tool for ensuring a consistent, clear, and impactful listening experience, especially crucial for playback in noisy environments, like cars or earbuds, or on systems with limited dynamic range, like phone speakers, Reducing the dynamic range too much definitely has negative consequences. It can make music sound fatiguing to listen to over time, feel flat or two-dimensional, or sound squashed and unnatural.
Robbing it of its breath.
Exactly. It robs the music of its natural nuance, its delicate soft touches, like the subtle dynamics of a piano performance or the natural decay of a cymbal, the subtle inflections in a vocal performance, or those quiet ghost notes on a snare drum that give a groove its feel. Over-flattening music means it loses its natural musicality, its expressive ebb and flow, its ability to build tension and release it dynamically. The art, the real skill, lies in finding that elusive sweet spot, the right amount and type of compression that achieves the desired control and impact without sacrificing the life and expression inherent in the performance.
And limiters, then, are like specialized extreme compressors, designed to be a strict brick wall ceiling, purely for peak control, not so much for shaping.
That's a perfect description. A limiter is essentially an extreme form of compressor. It typically uses a very high or often infinite ratio, like 100.1 or 8.1, and a blazingly fast attack time, often near instantaneous, sometimes even with look-ahead capability to anticipate peaks. Its primary purpose is not really subtle dynamic shaping, but to act as a strict brick wall ceiling, absolutely preventing the audio peaks from exceeding a set output level, usually set just below 0 dBFS, or more accurately, a target dBTP, like -1 dBTP, in digital mastering.
So they're the final safety net.
They are the crucial final safety net in mastering. They prevent digital clipping caused by any remaining stray peaks after all other processing, and they are also used, sometimes controversially, to maximize the overall perceived loudness of a track by allowing the average level to be raised higher without the peaks actually clipping. It's important to remember the distinction. All limiters are technically compressors, just with extreme settings, but not all compressors are limiters. Compressors are primarily for shaping dynamics and adding character. Limiters are primarily for absolute peak control and preventing overloads.
Now, I've heard of a technique called parallel compression, sometimes called New York compression. That sounds like a really clever amplitude trick that somehow allows you to get intense impact and preserve the original dynamics at the same time. How does that work?
It is a truly clever and very popular amplitude trick. It's a way to achieve intense punch, density, and sustain without totally squashing the life out of the original sound's natural dynamics. Here's the basic concept. You take a sound you want to enhance, say a snare drum track. You create a copy of that track, running it in parallel, hence the name.
Okay, so you have two identical snare tracks.
Right. Then, on the copied track, you apply extremely heavy compression, like really crush it with a high ratio, fast attack, maybe a slightly slower release to bring up the sustain. You might even intentionally drive this compressed copy into some desirable saturation or subtle distortion using the compressor's output gain or another plugin. The goal is to make this parallel track incredibly dense, punchy, and full of sustained energy, even if it sounds pretty unnatural on its own.
So you have this super squashed, maybe even gritty version of the snare that's just packed with energy.
Precisely. Then, and this is the crucial part, you subtly blend this heavily processed crush signal underneath the original largely uncompressed, or only lightly compressed, snare track. You mix the crush track in at a relatively low level.
So you don't really hear the crush track directly.
Ideally, you don't consciously hear the distortion or extreme compression of the parallel track itself, but what it does is add a hidden layer of punch, body, thickness, and consistency to the combined sound. The original snare still has its initial snappy, transient, and natural dynamic feel, but the blended-in crushed track fills in the gaps, adds sustain, and makes the whole thing feel significantly bigger, more solid, more powerful, and more consistent and level without making it sound obviously compressed.
Like a secret weapon for punch and density without killing the vibe.
Exactly. It's about overemphasizing certain qualities like the body or sustain on the parallel track and then blending just enough of that back in to enhance the original. It's very widely used on kick drums, snare drums, entire drum buses to make them sound huge and cohesive, bass guitars, and even vocals to add body and presence without losing intelligibility. It's a fantastic technique.
And de-essers, those are another specialized type of compressor, aren't they? Specifically for tackling sibilants, those harsh S sounds.
Yes, exactly. De-essers are specialized frequency-selective compressors. Their main job is to control sibilants, those potentially harsh or piercing S, sh, or T sounds in vocal recordings, which often occur in the high frequency range, typically somewhere between 4 kilohertz and 10 kilohertz, depending on the vocalist.
So they only react when those specific frequencies get too loud.
Precisely. Unlike a regular compressor that reacts to the overall level of the entire signal, A de-esser is designed to listen primarily to a specific high-frequency band where sibilance lives. It only applies gain reduction, compression, when the energy in that specific frequency band exceeds a set threshold. When the non-sibilant parts of the vocal come along, the de-esser does nothing. This provides highly targeted amplitude control just for those problematic sibilant frequencies, allowing you to smooth out a vocal track and make it less harsh or distracting without making the entire vocal sound dull or giving the singer an unnatural lisp, which can happen if you just try to EQ the harshness out globally.
Targeted amplitude control for specific frequency problems. Makes sense. So once all these tools, EQs, compressors, de-essers, maybe saturation are applied and all these individual tracks are balanced together in the mix, we get to the overarching principle of gain staging. This sounds like the art of optimizing levels as the signal moves through the entire audio chain, from the very first microphone preamp right through to the final mastering limiter, getting every step right.
Gain staging is indeed the art, or perhaps the discipline, of level management across the entire signal path. And it's one of the most fundamental skills for any audio engineer, whether working in analog or digital. It's the process of methodically setting and optimizing the signal levels as they pass through every single stage of amplification or processing in your audio chain. From the mic preamp gain through any hardware inserts, into the DIW channel through various plugins, each of which can affect the level, onto buses, and finally out through the master bus to your monitors or the final export file.
And the goal is always the same: maintain a healthy signal level everywhere.
Yes, the ultimate goal is always to maintain a healthy signal-to-noise ratio throughout the entire chain. This means the signal should always be significantly louder than the inherent noise floor of the equipment or digital system, ensuring clarity. But crucially, it should never be so loud at any single stage that it causes unwanted distortion or clipping in that stage or the next stage it feeds into. It's about setting each individual gain knob, input-output level on plugins, and fader correctly along the signal path so that the signal flows through cleanly and optimally at every point.
And this analog NV thing we mentioned earlier, the temptation, especially for people coming from the analog world, to push digital levels right up into the red zone of the meter just because it looks hot.
Yeah.
That's a major gain staging mistake in digital, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's a common and very detrimental mistake that violates good digital gain staging principles. In the analog world, as we discussed, pushing levels occasionally into the red zone of a VU meter might have yielded pleasing saturation and wasn't necessarily catastrophic. But in the digital realm, trying to mimic that look by pushing digital levels right up near 0 dBFS on a peak meter drastically reduces your headroom, makes clipping much more likely, including intersample clipping, and leaves no space for subsequent processing to work cleanly. It's just asking for trouble.
So good digital gain staging means keeping levels moderate throughout the chain.
Yes. This is why recommended recording levels in digital are moderate. For 16-bit audio, less common for recording now, aiming for peaks around NACNS 12 dBFS used to be standard practice, leaving a safe 12 dBF of headroom. For 24-bit audio, with its vastly greater dynamic range and lower noise floor, you can, and generally should, record even lower. Targeting average levels around NX18 dBFS, which often aligns with 0 VU on analog modeled gear, and letting peaks hit maybe max 10 dBFS or even just negative 6 dBFS is a very healthy approach.
Leaving tons of headroom.
Tons of headroom. This allows plugins room to work without clipping internally, prevents intersample peaks, avoids accidental overshoots, and gives you maximum flexibility later in the mix. Good gain staging means never letting the signal clip at any point in the chain, including inside individual plugins.
And you have to be careful managing levels on the mix bus too, right? Because even if all your individual tracks are perfectly gain staged and aren't clipping on their own channels, when they all sum together on the master bus, their combined level can easily push the master bus into clipping if you're not careful. This feels like where a lot of otherwise good mixes fall apart.
That's a critical point and a very common pitfall for less experienced mixers. When you combine dozens of individual tracks, drums, bass, guitars, keys, vocals, effects returns, all playing together on the main mix bus or master fader, their cumulative levels can sum up dramatically. Even if each individual track peaks at, say, negative 10 dBFS, the combined sum on the master bus could easily exceed 0 dBFS if you have enough tracks playing simultaneously.
Leading to master bus clipping.
Leading to nasty master bus cutting if you haven't managed your overall gain structure properly. A very common good practice, honed over decades of mixing experience, is to set your individual track levels so that the final mix, hitting the master bus, peaks somewhere comfortably below 0 dBFS. aiming for a maximum peak level of around -6 dBFS to -3 dBFS on the master fader before any final limiting is a very safe and professional target.
Why leave so much space?
This leaves adequate headroom for the final mastering stage. It gives the mastering engineer the crucial dynamic space they need to apply their final touches, subtle EQ, compression, stereo widening, and the final limiting stage, without having to fight against a mix that's already slammed against the digital ceiling and potentially distorted. It's also important to understand a nuance about modern debuggers. Many use 32-bit or 64-bit floating point processing internally for the mix engine.
What does floating point mean here?
Floating point math essentially means the DIW can handle signals above 0 dBFS internally temporarily without actually clipping the audio data within the DIW's mixer. This gives you some protection against accidental overloads on individual channels or buses during mixing. However, and this is the crucial catch, if the final signal sent out from your master bus to your speakers or exported to a fixed point file format like a standard 16-bit or 24-bit WAV file still exceeds 0 dBFS, that overload will result in hard clipping, and that distortion becomes fossilized, baked permanently into the final exported file. So careful management of the master bus output level is absolutely essential, regardless of whether your DAW uses floating point internally. You still need that headroom on the final output.
This whole discussion of levels, gain staging, and headroom leads us directly into one of the biggest and maybe most controversial stories in modern music production history. A real arms race that plagued the industry for decades, especially from the 90s through the 2000s. I'm talking about the Loudness Wars. This relentless pursuit by artists, labels, and engineers to make their tracks louder and louder than everyone else's, often at the significant expense of actual sound quality and dynamics.
Ah, yes. The Loudness War. It's a fascinating, if sometimes quite regrettable, chapter in audio history. Its roots actually go back further than most people realize, arguably beginning subtly in the 1940s and 50s with 7-inch vinyl singles. Producers and labels realized that a slightly louder single might stand out more on jukeboxes or grab more attention when played on the radio, where broadcasters often use their own compression and limiting.
So the incentive was there early on.
The incentive was there early on, but it escalated dramatically, becoming a full-blown war in the digital era, particularly with the advent of the compact disc CD in the 1980s and the rise of digital mastering tools in the 1990s.
Why did digital make it so much worse? Was it because CDs had that fixed digital ceiling at 0 dBFS, unlike vinyl, which had more physical limitations like the potential for the needle to skip or limitations on how much bass could be cut into the groove? This digital brick wall ceiling seems key.
That's exactly it. The 0 dBFS ceiling of the CD format, and later digital files, presented both a hard limit and, paradoxically, an opportunity. Unlike vinyl, where pushing levels too high had immediate physical consequences, the digital domain allowed engineers to make tracks incredibly loud on average without exceeding the absolute peak limit of 0 dBFS. They achieved this by using increasingly aggressive digital compression and, crucially, brick wall limiting.
So they squashed the dynamics flat.
They squashed the dynamics flatter and flatter. By heavily reducing the difference between the loudest peaks and the average level of the music, reducing the crest factor, they could then boost the overall level right up close to 0 dBFS without the peaks actually clipping most of the time. This made the track have a much higher average loudness, making it sound consistently loud.
And this was all driven by that powerful, yet ultimately maybe flawed belief that louder sounds better, especially in short A/B comparisons. That a louder track would grab more attention on the radio, in stores, or later on digital playlists.
Precisely. There's a well-documented psychoacoustic phenomenon where, in brief comparisons, the slightly louder of two otherwise identical pieces of audio is often perceived as sounding better, more exciting, more powerful, clearer. Record labels and even some artists and producers latched onto this, demanding louder and louder masters, fearing their track would sound weak or uncompetitive if it wasn't as loud as the next one. Studies analyzing the average loudness, often measured in RMS or later LUFS, of popular music releases clearly show a steady, relentless increase year after year from the 1980s right through the late 2000s.
And the consequences were pretty dire for audio quality, weren't they? Severely reduced dynamic range became the norm, leading to listener fatigue.
Absolutely. The most obvious consequence was the drastic reduction in dynamic range in many popular music genres. Music lost its natural ebb and flow, its light and shade. Everything was loud all the time. This often led to listener fatigue. Constantly loud audio can be physically tiring to listen to for extended periods. Worse, in the quest for maximum loudness, many masters suffered from audible distortion and clipping, either from pushing the limiters too hard or from intersample peaks caused by aggressive processing near 0 dBFS.
The infamous example everyone points to is Metallica's 2008 album Death Magnetic. It was widely criticized, even by fans, wasn't it, for sounding overly loud, distorted, and just generally unpleasant due to excessive limiting and clipping. It almost became a poster child for the loudness war gone wrong.
It really did. It generated a huge amount of discussion and backlash online and in the audio press, with many people complaining about the constant distortion and lack of dynamics, making it fatiguing and difficult to listen to, especially compared to previous albums or even the versions released for the Guitar Hero video game, which were apparently less compressed. It really highlighted the negative sonic consequences of taking the loudness war to its extreme.
And this trend also profoundly blurred the lines between the roles of mixing and mastering, didn't it? Mix engineers started feeling pressure to make their mixes loud right out of the gate.
Yes, that was another significant side effect. Mix engineers often began mixing into a limiter placed on their master bus, or sending mixes to the mastering engineer that were already heavily compressed and squashed, leaving little to no dynamic range for the mastering engineer to actually work with. Mastering traditionally involves subtle adjustments to tone, dynamics, and overall level, but it became increasingly difficult when mixes arrived already slammed to within an inch of 0 dBFS. It became an arms race, a real vicious cycle. If one producer or label didn't push the level to the maximum, their track might sound comparatively quieter and weaker next to others on the radio or a playlist, creating a powerful incentive for everyone to one-up each other's loudness. It felt like a race to the bottom, where dynamics, clarity, punch, and overall musicality were often sacrificed on the altar of sheer volume.
But then something shifted. An unlikely hero emerged, leading to what feels like an unspoken ceasefire, or at least a major de-escalation in the loudness wars. And it came from a completely unexpected place. Streaming platforms and broadcasters, they adopted loudness normalization standards, which, in a stroke of genius, effectively removed the incentive to be the loudest track on the block. This feels like one of the most significant changes in modern audio distribution.
It truly is one of the most significant and positive developments in professional audio in decades. What's truly insightful here is how a technical standard, driven by the need for a better listener experience, fundamentally changed an entire industry's artistic and commercial approach to mastering levels. Streaming services like Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, Amazon Music, Tidal, and others, along with traditional broadcasters, following standards like ATSC A85 in the US or EBU R128 in Europe, implemented loudness normalization.
And this is based on the ITUR BS.1770 standard and its use of LUFS, right? Loudness units full scale, which we mentioned are psychoacoustically weighted.
Exactly. These standards all rely on measuring perceived loudness using LUFS. Unlike simple peak or RMS measurements, the LUFS algorithm incorporates several key factors that align much better with human hearing. It uses a specific frequency weighting curve called K-weighting, which de-emphasizes very low bass and slightly boosts the mid-range, mimicking the ear's sensitivity according to those Fletcher-Mansani-So 226 curves. It also integrates the loudness measurement over time, typically measuring short-term, momentary, and overall integrated loudness to better reflect how we perceive sustained loudness rather than just peaks.
So how does the normalization actually work on these platforms? If your track is mastered too loud, according to their target LUFS level, they don't play it back louder than other tracks. Instead, they just turn it down.
That's the crucial game-changing mechanism. Each platform or broadcaster sets a specific target integrated LUFS level for playback. For example, Spotify, YouTube, and Amazon Music currently target around -14 LUFS integrated. Apple Music targets slightly lower, around -16 LUFS. European broadcast, EBU R128, targets -23 LUFS, allowing for wider dynamics. When you upload your track, the platform analyzes its integrated LUFS level. If your track is louder than their target, e.g. you mastered it to -9 LUFS, the platform simply applies a negative gain offset during playback to bring it down to their target. -14 LUFS in this case.
So your super loud master just gets turned down by 5 dB automatically.
Exactly. Conversely, if your track is significantly quieter than their target, they might apply positive gain to bring it up closer to the target level, though some platforms are more cautious about turning quiet tracks up too much due to potentially raising the noise floor.
So the entire advantage of mastering your track excessively loud just disappears. There's no benefit anymore to crushing the dynamics just to be the loudest.
Precisely. The incentive for excessively loud masters is completely eliminated because the platform will simply turn them down anyway. In fact, an overcompressed, hyper-limited track that was mastered purely for maximum loudness might even sound worse when turned down by the normalization process. Why? Because its dynamics are already crushed flat. When it's played back at the normalized level alongside a track that was mastered less aggressively and retained more dynamic range, the overcompressed track can sound thin, small, lifeless, and squashed in comparison. The track with more dynamics, even though its peaks might be lower, will often sound punchier, fuller, and more engaging after normalization.
Wow. So it actually encourages preserving dynamics now, because a track with a wider dynamic range might actually sound better and more impactful on these platforms after normalization.
That's the beautiful irony and the positive outcome. The focus shifts away from just hitting 0 dBFS or achieving the highest possible LUFS number towards creating a master that sounds great at the target LUFS level and retains its sonic character, punch, and perceived density even after potentially being turned down by the platform. It encourages engineers and artists to prioritize good dynamics, clarity, and musicality over sheer brute force loudness.
So the modern mixing and mastering workflow has fundamentally shifted then. It's no longer primarily about maximizing peak levels, but about carefully managing perceived loudness, LUFS, and ensuring those true peaks, dBTP, are kept safely in check to meet the new delivery standards. It's a completely different mindset.
It is a fundamental paradigm shift for anyone delivering music in the 21st century. The focus has moved decisively from maximizing peak levels towards intelligently managing perceived loudness and rigorously controlling true peak levels. Mastering engineers now typically work towards specific LUFS targets based on the intended distribution platform, -14 LUFS for most streaming, maybe slightly higher, like -10 to -12 LUFS for a loud CD master if requested, or -23 LUFS for broadcast. And crucially, managing the true peak level is now paramount. Using a reliable true peak limiter as the very last stage in the mastering chain, set to a ceiling of a -1 dBTP or even -2 dBTP, is standard practice. This prevents intersample clipping, ensures compliance with platform specs, and guarantees clean, distortion-free playback on any consumer device anywhere in the world. It requires a subtle, informed balancing act, hitting the technical targets while still creating an aesthetically compelling master that preserves the intricate relationship between amplitude, dynamics, and perceived loudness that serves the music best.
It's amazing how technical all of this sounds. Decibels, meters, LUFS, dBTP, ratios, thresholds. But when you peel it back, it's really all in service of artistry, isn't it? Controlling amplitude, understanding decibels, using meters, EQ, compression. It feels like it's far more than just a set of technical decisions. It's a fundamental artistic choice, constantly shaping the emotional journey of the listener, often without them even noticing.
Absolutely, you've hit the nail on the head. This is where the science truly meets the art, where the technical knowledge becomes a tool for creative expression. Amplitude and loudness and the dynamic range they define are as much fundamental artistic elements, as much potent tools for storytelling in music as pitch, rhythm, harmony, or timbre. They are meticulously shaped and controlled by skilled engineers and producers to guide the listener through the song's emotional narrative.
Shaping its dynamic contour, you mean? Like building energy from a quiet, introspective verse up to a soaring, powerful chorus.
Exactly that, creating those moments of tension and release, using dynamics to create dramatic breakdowns where everything drops out, except maybe a vocal in a simple beat, making the return of the full instrumentation feel even more impactful. Surging back up for a grand finale. This is the cinematic pacing of music, and it's deliberately shaped by the engineer's hands, often using automation to precisely control fader levels, maybe automating compression settings over time, or even using subtle EQ changes throughout the song to enhance that sense of journey, constantly pushing and pulling the listener's emotions along with the music.
And it's not just about those obvious volume changes or compressor settings, is it? Even subtle choices can affect perceived loudness and the overall shape.
Not at all. It's a complex interplay. And what's truly fascinating here is that perceived loudness isn't solely determined by fader levels or how hard a compressor is working. As we touched on, even simple panning choices matter. Panning a sound hard to one side, for example, can make it seem slightly less loud or prominent than if it's placed dead center in the stereo field, simply because of how our binaural hearing localizes sound.
Interesting. EQ choices, too, are incredibly powerful tools for manipulating perceived loudness without necessarily changing the peak level much. Boosting certain frequencies, especially those upper mid-frequencies around 2 to 5 kilohertz where the ear is most sensitive, can make an instrument or vocal feel significantly louder, more present, more forward in the mix, even if its actual peak dBFS level hasn't changed significantly. Conversely, carefully cutting harsh or resonant frequencies can make a sound seem smoother, less aggressive, and perhaps sit further back.
So by carefully managing all these complex interrelationships, fader levels, panning positions, EQ curves, compression characteristics, maybe even reverb and delay levels, which affect perceived distance, engineers are essentially creating depth and dimension in the mix, establishing foreground and background elements, almost like painting with sound, using amplitude relationships to create perspective.
Precisely. That's a beautiful way to put it. Painting with sound using amplitude relationships. For instance, background elements like pads or subtle percussion might be mixed with less dynamic range, more compression, and maybe less high-frequency content using EQ to make them sit further back in the soundstage. This allows the foreground elements, like the lead vocal or a solo instrument, which might have more dynamics and brighter EQ, to really pop out with more urgency, clarity, and presence. It's all about creating contrast and focus using level and dynamics.
And this ties directly back into that eternal trade-off we keep discussing, the balance between achieving impact and preserving expression, the constant push and pull that seems to define what makes a great mix or master.
It really is the core artistic tension. Aggressive compression, for example, provides undeniable impact. It makes things sound tight, controlled, punchy, finished like a professional record. It helps glue the various elements of a mix together, giving it a powerful, cohesive, modern feel. Those are all desirable qualities, especially in certain genres.
But there's always a cost, isn't there? A potential loss.
There's always a potential cost. Pushing compression too hard or using it inappropriately can easily sacrifice nuance. It can diminish the delicate touches in a performance, the subtle dynamic variations in a piano part, the natural decay of a cymbal, the breath and subtle inflections that convey emotion in a vocal performance, or those quiet ghost notes on a snare drum that give a rhythm its groove and human feel. Over-flattening the music, removing too much of its natural dynamic variation, can rob it of its life, its breath, its musicality, and its expressive power. It can become relentless and fatiguing.
Finding that right balance, that sweet spot between delivering raw impact and preserving that natural dynamic expression, that feels like the real art, the subjective judgment call that every engineer and artist wrestles with on every single project. It's not just about technical settings.
It's entirely about artistic judgment, informed by technical understanding. Mastering legends like the late, great Greg Calby often pointed out that the mixes that measure the loudest, the ones with the highest LUFS numbers, aren't always the ones that are the most pleasing or engaging to listen to over the long term. They can often sound brittle, harsh, fatiguing, two-dimensional, and frankly just lack depth and emotional impact compared to mixes with more breathing room.
And Bernie Grundman, another absolute legend in mastering, has often warned passionately against using compression or limiting in a way that is audibly working all the time, where you can constantly hear the effect pumping or sucking the life out of the music. He famously stated that the real challenge isn't just whether you use processing, but how you drive it, meaning applying compression and limiting thoughtfully, musically, transparently, and only when and where it truly serves the music, not just cranking the level for the sake of it. The loudness war has definitely pushed things towards the latter, often sacrificing beautiful dynamics and nuance for sheer volume, sometimes sadly hurting the music in the process. It's a constant negotiation between technical possibilities and artistic intent. And once that incredibly intricate dance of amplitude control, the mixing, the processing, the mastering is finally done, how do engineers ensure that their meticulously crafted sonic creation actually sounds good out there in the real world? How do they make sure it translates well onto all the vastly different playback systems people use today? From tiny phone speakers to laptop speakers to booming car stereos to cheap earbuds to high-end audiophile systems, that seems like a huge challenge.
It is a huge challenge, and mixed translation is absolutely paramount. A technically perfect mix that only sounds good on the expensive, perfectly tuned monitors in the controlled environment of the studio is ultimately a failure if it falls apart or sounds completely different on the systems most people actually listen on. Good, experienced engineers are absolutely religious about checking their mixes on a wide variety of consumer playback systems.
They really listen on crappy speakers on purpose.
Oh, absolutely. They'll typically have a main set of high-quality studio monitors, but they'll also have smaller, cheaper, near-field monitors like the infamous Yamaha NS10s or modern equivalents like Oratones. Maybe a Bluetooth speaker, a laptop. They'll check it on common earbuds and definitely take it out to listen in their car. They constantly switch between these systems during the mixing process.
What are they listening for?
They're listening to ensure the fundamental balance holds up. Does the vocal stay intelligible on small speakers? Does the bass disappear completely, or does it become overwhelmingly boomy in the car? Do important elements get lost? Does the overall energy and feel translate? They're checking that all those careful amplitude decisions they made, the balance between kick and bass, the clarity of the lead vocal against the guitars, the impact of the drums still work and convey the intended artistic message accurately, no matter how compromised the playback system might be. It's the final, crucial reality check for all those hours spent manipulating levels and dynamics.
And finally, thinking about amplitude control right back at the start of the process during the actual recording session itself, there's one element that relies entirely on getting amplitude balance right, and it's absolutely critical for the quality of the performance being captured. I was talking about the headphone mix for the performer, the singer, the guitarist, the drummer. Why is getting that headphone mix right so utterly important?
This is such a critical point and often overlooked by people outside the recording process. It directly links precise amplitude control in the monitoring environment directly to the quality of the art being created in real time. An expert quoted in one of our sources puts it very clearly and emphatically. You must have a good headphone mix, and if it's not right as the performer, keep complaining until it's right.
Why is it that critical?
It's absolutely critical because the headphone mix is the performer's only connection to the music they're creating and playing along with. It directly affects almost every aspect of their performance. Their pitch, especially for singers, if they can't hear themselves clearly against the track, their piece will suffer. Their timing, if the click track or drums aren't at the right level, their timing can drift. Their dynamics, if the mix feels too loud or too quiet, it affects how loud or soft they play or sing. And even their emotional delivery. If the mix doesn't feel inspiring or supportive, it can inhibit their performance.
So a bad headphone mix can directly lead to a subpar recording.
Absolutely. If the balance is off, if the singer can't hear their pitch reference, if the guitarist can't hear the bass clearly, if the drummer feels disconnected from the groove, their performance will inevitably suffer, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. Getting the levels just right in the performer's headphones, ensuring they can hear themselves comfortably and clearly in the context of the track, with the right balance of other instruments, is fundamental to capturing a great take. It's the immediate feedback loop that allows the artist to connect deeply with the music and deliver their absolute best performance. It's amplitude control directly enabling artistry.
It's incredible to think about this journey of amplitude, from a physical wave in the air through all these different electrical and digital stages, measured in so many different ways, controlled by all these tools, and ultimately shaping not just the final sound, but the performance itself. It reminds me of a groundbreaking historical example of someone using amplitude manipulation in an extreme way for a deliberate artistic effect. Phil Spector's famous wall of sound technique back in the 60s, that was an early and pretty extreme example of deliberate amplitude manipulation for dramatic artistic effect, wasn't it? Taking control of levels to a whole new place.
Absolutely. Spector's Wall of Sound was truly revolutionary for its time, and it stands as a landmark example of using the recording studio itself, particularly amplitude control and processing, as an instrument to create a unique, powerful sonic signature. It was an extreme artistic manipulation of amplitude, dynamics, and space for a singular, massive sonic impression.
What was he actually doing? It wasn't just turning things up loud, was it?
Not at all. His technique was much more sophisticated, focused on density and blending. It involved massive layering or doubling. He'd have multiple musicians playing the same or very similar parts simultaneously, maybe 3 or 4 guitars, all strumming the same chords, multiple pianos playing the same figures, several drummers playing similar patterns.
Full recorded together.
Often recorded together live in a large reverberant room, like Gold Star Studios' famous echo chambers, to capture a huge natural room sound and blend the instruments acoustically before they even hit the microphones. Then he would often drench these layered tracks in additional plate reverb or echo chamber effects. And crucially, he would then meld all of these elements together using heavy compression and limiting during the mixing and mastering stages.
So he was deliberately reducing the dynamic range of the individual parts to make them merge into one huge sound.
Exactly. He used amplitude control, specifically the reduction of dynamic range through layering and heavy compression, to create an overwhelming, cohesive, dense, almost monophonic, even when recorded to stereo, sonic impression. The individual instruments often became indistinct, merging into this massive wall where the sheer combined power and reverberant texture became the defining characteristic rather than the clarity or separation of individual parts. It was designed to sound incredible coming out of small AM radio speakers or jukeboxes.
So he was essentially building a kind of sonic sculpture in the studio. Not just capturing a live performance as it happened, but truly constructing a completely new, larger-than-life sound specifically for the record itself using amplitude, layering, and processing.
Precisely. His work fundamentally revolutionized record production. It demonstrated powerfully that a recording could be its own unique artistic creation, a sonic sculpture built with amplitude control, processing, and studio techniques as primary tools, rather than just being a transparent documentation of a live musical event. It fundamentally changed how people thought about making records, showing how dynamics, or sometimes the careful lack of them through deliberate manipulation, could be the very canvas for creating a powerful mood, telling a story, and crafting an undeniable, immersive sonic experience for the listener. It showed amplitude control as a primary artistic force.
So bringing this all together now, thinking about everything we've covered from the physics of sound waves to psychoacoustics to LUFS targets. For you, the learner, the music lover listening right now, what's the deeper meaning here? It seems clear that controlling amplitude, understanding decibels, using meters, EQ, compression, it's way more than just technical expertise, isn't it?
It truly is. I hope that's the main takeaway. It's a fundamental artistic choice that permeates every single aspect of music creation, production, and reproduction. Every fader move you see an engineer make, every compressor setting they dial in, every EQ tweak, every mastering decision, it's all part of an invisible hand, guided by both technical knowledge and artistic intent that shapes how you ultimately experience the music. It sculpts the dynamic journey of the song, dictates its emotional impact, manages its clarity and punch, and ultimately helps tell the story the artist wants to convey.
So dynamic range isn't just some number on a spec sheet or a meter, it's the very canvas for musical expression and storytelling.
Not at all. It's the very space where the music lives and breathes. It's the landscape across which the musical narrative unfolds. It's where the tension builds in a quiet bridge and finds release in a powerful chorus. It's the difference between being drawn in intimately or being hit with exhilarating force. When you start to understand how amplitude is being deliberately shaped, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically throughout a piece of music, you gain a much deeper, richer appreciation for the incredible craft, the thoughtful artistry, and the powerful storytelling that goes into the music you love. You start hearing the intent behind the sound choices.
So maybe a little challenge for everyone listening.
Yeah.
Next time you put on a track, any track you love, don't just focus on the melody, the harmony, or the beat. Try listening specifically, intentionally, to the amplitude and its dynamics. Ask yourself,
Does it breathe? Does it have moments of quiet that make the loud moments feel even bigger? Or is it consistently intense? Does it push and pull you along emotionally with its changes in level? Does it draw you in quietly and intimately in the verses? Or does it grab you right from the start and never let go with sheer force and energy?
what story is its loudness, its dynamics actually telling you? Is it supporting the lyrics? Is it creating a mood?
And remember, the goal isn't always louder is better. That was the fallacy of the loudness war. The real goal, the art of it, is about finding what's just right. The perfect dynamic shape, the ideal level relationships for that specific song's unique feeling, its message, and its intended impact.
That's the true mastery of sound levels. And that, my friend, feels like the real deep dive.